Good afternoon, everybody. This is the deeper dive portion of the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. And today we have with us a associate professor from the University of Virginia, Dr. Justene Hill Edwards. And Dr. Edwards is paving new ground in terms of analyzing the intersection of capitalism and racism in America. She's working, or they are working with her, but there is a project at Columbia University on U.S. capitalism. And it starts in the beginning of the U.S. and moves forward. And Justene's first book was about the beginnings of the marketplace and capitalism in colonial South Carolina and in the early mid-1700s, late 1700s, that I don't know if Justene is going to speak maybe briefly about that tonight. A little bit, she says, and that her new book, which is just out, is the one on the Freedmen's Bank, freedman as opposed to freedmen, the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll be talking a lot about that tomorrow night when Vernon Burton talks about the Reconstruction era. But the Freedmen's Bank, this book, the title of it is The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank. And it's the betrayal that is the piece that Dr. Hill Edwards has done original research on. If you go and read about the Freedmen's Bank, most of the copy that you'll read talks about the poor management resulting in the collapse. Well, Dr. Hill Edwards is going to unpack the poor management for us and how that came about. But I wanted to tell you that her first book came to my appearance in a little blurb in the New York Times, and it was she was doing a book presentation at Oxford University at the Bill Clinton Institute of American Policy at Oxford. And I said, whoa, I've always wanted to go to Oxford. And so I thought, I didn't think I could get into the Zoom, but they not only took me into the Zoom, but it was Justine and I and about 12 people. It was one, I thought there'd be a great big hall. And one guy who looked just exactly like you would expect an Oxford dean to look like, very pompous and all well dressed in tweed. And at some point, the original book is talking about the enslaved people developing trade, growing food, selling food, making baskets, selling baskets, and they were getting money. That meant they could like flee. And so the masters had to figure out a way to keep them down on the farm. And that is the book that was the first book that came out, what, 4 or 5 years ago, Justine?
4 years ago. Wow. Yes. 4 years ago.
Time flies.
I know.
But she was talking about the industriousness of these enslaved people. And this old Oxford dean said, I hardly believe that people in prison are industrious. And I had the occasion to ask him, so how long have you been in prison to make that statement? And I had that prison experience and told him he was wrong. And Justine and I bonded after that, and she's been our guest ever since. We're very, very, very grateful. And so Dr. Hill Edwards, take it away. You talk for an hour, we'll take questions. Sounds good?
Sounds great. Brett, thank you as always for the invitation and the introduction. Yes, this is probably my third or fourth time speaking about the research, and so it's always a pleasure to be invited to speak with your students and your audience about work that that I think is incredibly fascinating, that I've been spending my life now really writing about and speaking about. So thank you again for the invitation. So as Brett mentioned, I did just come out with the new book. It came out October of last year, and I think I see it as probably what happens after the time period of my first book. And so my first book on free markets, which I'll talk a little bit about here, looks at the slaves economy and the way that the enslaved built their own economic lives in slavery, not as property, not as capital, but as independent economic actors. And so I consider myself to be a historian of Black economic life in America, but I focus on the 18th and 19th centuries, meaning the period of slavery. And the book that I'll be talking about and the work that I'll be talking about with you this afternoon really looks at the period after that. And so the period of Reconstruction, which I believe is woefully understudied. I was kind of surprised at how much I didn't know about this period going into this project. But we are in a period of what some might call deconstruction, right? Deconstructing the ways in which we have built our institutions to support Americans more broadly. And the period that we are in is oddly similar in some ways to the period of Reconstruction. And so hopefully we can have a conversation about that after I finish my comments. But I'm gonna do, let's see, let's start the slideshow. And okay, I should know how to do this by now. Let's do this. Okay. Thumbs up if you can see the
Yeah.
slide.
Good.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So on March 14th, 1870, a Black man walked along Bay Street in Beaufort, South Carolina. Let's see, there we go. That's Bay Street. As he strolled past the shops and homes that dotted the unpaved street, he passed the facades, the front parts of homes that were weathered by the mayhem of the Civil War. Beaufort was one of the first cities to fall to the Union during the war, which set the stage for the emancipation of the region's enslaved population, of which this man was a member. As he walked past fellow residents, both black and white, perhaps he was thinking about how different Bay Street had looked a mere 5 years earlier as the Civil War and legal bondage came to an end. And remember, this is in 1870. The remnants of slavery were still ever present on Bay Street. Um, Houses dotted the streets, and all of these homes and shops were once owned by ex-Confederates, and these homes were kind of abutting the gravel-filled road. Beaufort was a bustling port city in its heyday and was home to the nation's richest families during the first half of the 19th century. These slaveholding families built generational wealth through investing in South Carolina's major export, of course, Carolina gold rice. They tapped into national and international banking networks to finance their investments in rice cultivation. Beaufort's enslavers formed relationships with bankers as far away as New York and even London, from whom they requested lines of credit to buy enslaved laborers. They forced the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people to cultivate rice that propelled these slaveholding capitalists in South Carolina to really global economic prominence. The Black man surely remembered the ships docked in the Beaufort Harbor and the enslaved men who loaded rice onto vessels headed to New York, New Orleans, or Liverpool. In the early decades of the 19th century, Beaufort's hustle and bustle reflected the wealth of the white enslavers, slave traders, and merchants, people whose families called Beaufort home for generations. But they would not have been able to put their wealth on public display without the rice and cotton cultivated, harvested, and prepared for transport by the region's enslaved people. These white families poured capital into maintaining slavery as an institution, relying on enslaved laborers to build their fortunes in the process. The African American man was owned by one of these families. And so memories of the sectional conflict in this man's remarkable quest for survival may have kind of snuck into his mind as he fixed his eyes on the building that you see here, this ecru building with a two-story portico. He marched up this small flight of stairs that led him to a simple lobby. This man who lived through the unpredictability of slavery must have felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension as he opened the door because the building that he opened was a bank. But this bank was no ordinary financial institution. It served a particularly vulnerable but optimistic population of people, African Americans recently freed from slavery. And so the formerly enslaved man entered the Beaufort, South Carolina branch of the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company, also known as the Freedmen's Bank. And the bank was a private financial institution. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. Chartered by Congress in the final months of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln signed the bank into existence on the last day of his first term as president. Okay. And so the branch that the man walked into that you see here was opened in October of 1866. So on that day in March of 1870, when the African American man encountered the Buford branch or entered the Buford branch of the Freedmen's Bank, he was actually absorbing the messages that opening a bank account with this financial institution would help formerly enslaved people like him assimilate into the body politic through embracing the benefits of American capitalism. And he was surely hoping that his investment in this bank would help his climb into the period of freedom out of slavery. And some of you, I'm sure, will know who this Black man was. He gained notoriety during the American Civil War. And this is where you see the Freedmen's Bank. The man that I'm talking about now, his name was Robert Smalls. And of course, I'm sure as many of you know, Smalls catapulted himself to national prominence for his brave actions during the Civil War. On the evening of May 12th, 1862, the then 23-year-old Smalls snuck aboard and commandeered a Confederate ship docked in Charleston Harbor. The Confederate soldiers responsible for manning the ship left it unattended for the night, leaving ammunition, firearms, and 8 enslaved people on board. He deployed navigation skills that he developed as a young enslaved boy, and Smalls decided to take control of the ship under the cover of night. He steered it with the enslaved people on board towards a fleet of Union vessels stationed outside of Charleston Harbor. His daring act secured him his freedom. He also garnered an official commendation from the Union Army and a $1,500 award from the federal government for his wartime heroics. And so though there is no information about how much Robert Smalls deposited into his account, there is a record of his race here, and what you see here is his depositor record. I can talk a little bit about how you can access these records later, but they are accessible online and available to the public. And so we can gain a lot of information by looking at a depositor record and looking specifically here at the one for Robert Smalls. Again, there's a good amount of information here, right? He's listed as Black, his residence, which was Beaufort, South Carolina, his occupation. Importantly, as a member of South Carolina's House of Representatives, he was a member, as it says, of the legislature. And Smalls, of course, was one of the first African American men to serve in the South Carolina General Assembly and one of the first Black men elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And so he, I'm sure, hoped that his opening of an account and his investment in the bank would help him sustain his swift rise from enslaved man to politician representing African Americans just out of enslavement. And so again, we have some really interesting information here. This is a record, of course, for Robert Smalls. That's at the top, the date of application, March 14th, 1870. He could have offered more information, where he was born, where he was brought up, his complexion, which was interesting, who he worked for, whether he had wife, children, who his father, mother, brothers were. And so these types of records are actually records that genealogists love because it provides a treasure trove of information about recently emancipated African Americans. And it provides information about how they constructed their families. And so if you kind of do a search here, you might find entire family trees really fit onto these really small documentary records. And so it is fascinating. And so I wish I could say that Black depositors such as Robert Smalls used the bank's promise of helping formerly enslaved people to buy land, save money, and build an economic safety net for themselves and their families that would last for generations. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Depositors like Robert Smalls would continue when the bank ultimately collapsed in 1874. And the bank's collapse shaped their beliefs about the federal government's role in protecting their economic livelihoods and even shaped the ways in which African Americans interacted with the financial services industry into the late 19th, the 20th, and I would argue even the 21st century. And so the bank, the Freedmen's Bank, was the brainchild of a white New Jersey minister and abolitionist named John Alvord. And so during the war, Alvord traveled around the South, and in 1864, he was specifically tasked with following Union General William T. Sherman on his famed March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah of 1864. And so Alvord took the opportunity to speak to as many freed people as possible about their goals for their lives out of slavery. And he noticed that they wanted two things above all else. First, they wanted to be reunited with their families. And secondly, they wanted land and access to land. And so Alvord revealed the extent to which Black soldiers and indeed whites as well needed access to safe and stable financial services. And so in late 1864, Alvord, for example, he writes this to his wife. He writes about how he encountered a white officer in Hilton Head, South Carolina, who showed him a trunk filled with $75,000 in Black soldiers' pay. They had no secure place to keep their money, and they believed that the best solution was to give their earnings to someone that they hoped would keep their money safe, and so a white officer. These observations inspired Alvord's next step, which was to establish the Freedmen's Bank. And so he wrote this: I came north full of the idea and called together gentlemen in New York who agreed to take hold of the enterprise. So on January 27th, 1865, Alvord gathered a group of prominent white bankers, businessmen, and philanthropists for a meeting to create a bank for the nation's freed people. And it took less than 2 months from that first meeting for Alvord's idea of creating the Freedmen's Bank to move from congressional to presidential approval. And so what you see here was the first page of the Freedmen's Bank Act. It was signed on March 3rd, 1865. And it was one of the last pieces of legislation that Lincoln signed on his last day of the first term as president. He actually signed it the day before his second inauguration. And so the Freedmen's Bank, and I'll say this a couple times this afternoon, the Freedmen's Bank was established as a simple savings bank where depositors could merely open accounts, deposit money, and earn a small amount of interest on their deposits. The bank's trustees were entrusted with investing a third of depositors' money in very low risk investments, very low risk financial products. At this time, we're talking about government bonds and securities. And so the bank's first trustees and supporters were actually a who's who of white abolitionists, businessmen, military men, and philanthropists. And these men, in signing their names to the 50-person board of trustees, were essentially co-signing the bank's mission. And that was to introduce formerly enslaved people to ideas of what they called thrift, savings, and ultimately to the benefits of American-style capitalism. But what the bank's founders and what John Alvord in particular did not understand was that Black people at this time had been cultivating knowledge of banking and finance for generations. And Brett will know this from my first book on free markets, where I talk about the fact that the enslaved had been developing ideas of finance and economics from the very first moment that slavery was legally recognized in Carolina. The enslaved were constantly finding ways to earn money, to trade, sometimes even with their own enslavers, with one another, with poor whites. It's not uncommon, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, for enslaved Black women, for example, to be in the Charleston marketplace haggling with customers to buy their wares and their goods. And so the enslaved African Americans brought with them and were armed with very particular and specific ideas about finance economics. And all of this was forged through their experiences in slavery. And unfortunately, the bank's white trustees and administrators didn't understand or appreciate this. And this idea that they needed to teach African Americans about saving and banking would kind of become this idea that drove a wedge between them and the ideas that African Americans were bringing with them. But for Black soldiers in particular, some had had recent experiences with making their first foray into banking, with the establishment of three military savings banks, all established in 1864 to serve the needs and the increasing numbers of Black men in the U.S. Army. And so during the Civil War, Black men, through their enlistment in the U.S. Army, were for the first time receiving regular pay from the federal government for their military service. However, it became clear to not only Black soldiers, but to Union generals that Black soldiers actually needed a more streamlined way to handle their finances and their pay. And that is to say that they were earning money, but they were having a hard time keeping their money safe. And the problem was not one of them squandering their wages, because in fact they had the opposite dilemma. Some soldiers were so flush with money that they earned from their military service, but they wanted to send their wages back to their families, specifically their wives and their children. But again, they had no way to keep their money safe. And so instead, Black soldiers were often giving their money to white superiors, hoping that these white superiors would keep their money safe for them. And so the Freedmen's Bank was actually modeled off of three military savings banks established in the fall and summer of 1864 for Black Union soldiers. The first of the three military savings banks was the Free Labor Bank in New Orleans, established by Union General N.P. Banks. Two other savings banks were established, one in Norfolk, Virginia by General Benjamin Butler, and a third in Beaufort, South Carolina by General Rufus Saxton. The military banks actually did serve both Black soldiers and white soldiers alike, but there were fundamental problems with the banks. The most glaring one was that the banks were under the jurisdiction of the Department of War, not the Department of Treasury. This meant that the military savings banks were not under the direct supervision of the newly created financial regulator, the first financial regulator in U.S. history, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, also known today as the OCC. And the OCC was established in February of 1863 to help regulate national banks in the U.S. and bring state banks under the national bank umbrella, encouraging and sometimes forcing them to use the American dollar. And so these financial institutions, the military savings banks, actually lacked the broad oversight that the OCC was created to regulate. And that would turn into a problem. This problem of lax regulation would continue with the establishment of the Freedmen's Bank in March of 1865. But despite insufficient oversight from federal authorities, interest in these savings banks grew quite quickly, especially among Black soldiers. For example, by the end of the war in April of 1865, the Beaufort Military Savings Bank held approximately $200,000 in Black soldiers' pay. Today, that would be about $4.1 million, all earned by Black soldiers for their military service. So, African Americans, like those who patronized the Beaufort, South Carolina branch of the military bank, were clearly an untapped market for the American banking industry. And the bankers and philanthropists who founded and worked for the Freedmen's Bank found ways to take full advantage of this new market for new depositors and customers. And so, after the bank received its congressional charter on March of 1865, it grew steadily. Between June 1865 and October 1866, there were 19 branches. And so the bank grew incredibly quickly, with the military savings banks in Norfolk, in New Orleans, and in Beaufort being rolled into official Freedmen's Bank branches. And you'll see here the first established in Norfolk in June of 1865. The branch in Charleston being established in January of 1866, and the branch in Beaufort being established in October of 1866. And so Even though African Americans, again, were armed with very concrete ideas about saving and about banking, um, agents for the Freedmen's Bank, in conjunction with the Freedmen's Bureau, which I hear you'll learn more about tomorrow, were traveling around the South, making personal pleas in Black communities and actually advocating on the ground for the bank. But these predominantly white officials often use paternalistic language and tone to address potential Black depositors. In May 1868, for example, a man named Andrew Geddes, an assistant commissioner with the Freedmen's Bureau, celebrated the success of the bank. He was describing how the bank was run, the safety of deposits, and how interest on bank deposits accrued, summarizing that every deposit earns something, and by the system of compounding interest, the original amount doubles itself every few years. And so this message about the soundness and security of the bank did not stop with explaining the benefits of compounding interest payments. Geddes wanted to tell depositors about the advantages they would gain from foregoing, as he said, tobacco, liquor, jewelry, and fancy clothing. And he said depositing their savings in Freedmen's bank accounts would help them better and more than buying things that they did not need. He even used the saying, a penny saved is a penny earned, to encourage African Americans to open accounts. With his message connecting banking to economic prosperity and political inclusion, Geddes assumed that African Americans did not understand how to use their wages and earnings to make their lives better. Of course, we know that they did, which was one of the reasons why they opened bank accounts in the first place. And so, with an air of paternalism, Geddes asserted one great and important lesson for you to learn is the value and power of money. His advice to African Americans about the economic privileges of banking and its connection to citizenship reflected his confusion and his real ignorance about why African Americans had decided to patronize the bank in the first place. And that was first and foremost to secure their own economic futures. And so, as I said, I'm interested broadly in Black economic life, especially in and around the period of slavery. And so, as I was working on this book and really attempting to connect the history of the Freedmen's Bank with the work that I did in my first book, I kept asking, what economic knowledge did the enslaved bring with them into this period of freedom? This was constantly in my mind as I was thinking about how to talk about African Americans' engagement with the bank. And so, of course, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it was not uncommon for the enslaved, especially enslaved Black women, to find ways to make and earn money. Enslaved African women in colonial South Carolina, for example, were visible in Charleston. And Charleston was one of the most vibrant and important marketplaces in the colonial period, even into the mid 19th century. And they held actually a visible amount of power and autonomy in these spaces. And this autonomy afforded them the opportunity to make money for themselves, to insert themselves directly in commodity exchanges and in the exchange of money. I would say that they were at the literal center of commercial life in cities such as Charleston. And they were not relegated to simply working as enslaved laborers. Instead, they were active economic agents. They were buying goods, selling wares, making and selling baskets, oftentimes for a lot of money. They were negotiating, they were haggling with customers, Black and white, enslaved and free. And they were active participants in the growth of capitalism in South Carolina. And this growth of capitalist enterprise, again, helped to catapult enslavers, slave traders, and investors to economic prominence nationally and internationally. And so African Americans were bringing these ideas with them into the period of freedom. And these ideas shaped why and how they interacted with the bank's administrators, the bank managers and cashiers, and with the institution more broadly. And so, despite the messaging that Black people were receiving about the fact that they needed guidance to help support themselves through saving and thrift, They helped the bank to expand quickly, and the bank's reach continued to expand into the late 1860s and early 1870s, such that at its height, by 1872, there were 37 branches, excuse me, in 17 states, from Mobile, Alabama, and Richmond, Virginia, to Baltimore, Maryland, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as you see in this map, there were bank branches as far north as New York. New York was actually the central office of the Freedmen's Bank for its first 2 years when it moved to Washington, D.C. in 1867. I'll talk a little bit about that. Um, there were there were branches again all around Virginia, from Norfolk to Lynchburg to Richmond to Alexandria, and actually, I'm here in Charlottesville, Virginia. There was a branch proposed in Charlottesville. There were branches in the Low Country, of course, Charleston, Beaufort, in Georgia, Savannah, Augusta, Atlanta, Macon. There were proposed branches as far west as Texas. And a caveat there is that while I'm talking about Black economic life here, Reconstruction was a period of immense racial violence. The sheer prevalence of white racial terrorism against freed men, women, and children, against Black families, was really unprecedented. There were branches proposed as far west as Texas and Galveston and in Houston, but with the sheer level of white violence against African Americans, the bank's administrators decided not to open those branches for fear that they would not get off the ground from the violence of white vigilantes in these regions. And so, but despite all of this, the bank grew quite quickly. Individuals such as Frederick Douglass and his sons opened accounts. I'll talk about Douglass here in a minute. Businesses and institutions opened accounts. Even Howard University in DC had an account. And so by 1872, the bank had grown to include approximately 70,000 depositors, with deposits totaling more than $57 million. That's about $1.5 billion today, the vast majority of which deposited by African Americans recently emancipated from slavery. And so, if we kind of get to a more granular level, almost half of the depositors had about $50 or less in their accounts, and so smaller amounts, and about 3,000 had a bit more. And so the average single de deposit was about $50, and the average total sum was about $830. Again, a tremendous amount. And so the bank's success, especially in its first 5 years, covered more dangerous influences within the bank's board of trustees. And it began in earnest in 1867. And so only 2 years into the bank's operation. In 1867, after depositors had entrusted the bank with millions of dollars of their hard-earned savings, at the behest of John Alvord, the bank's founder, who would become president in 1868, a year later, the trustees agreed to relocate the bank's headquarters from New York to Washington, D.C. It was a transition closer to the heart of political power. In 1868, the trustees agreed to purchase a new central office, the building that you see here. It is currently, well, it resided within the White House complex adjacent to the White House and the Department of Treasury on Pennsylvania Avenue. And it's located in a prime location. Frederick Douglass believed that spending money on this beautiful new building was a waste. He said that they used extravagant materials to put the bank's success on public display. But this was not necessarily, I'm sure, what bank depositors wanted the bank to spend their hard-earned savings on. A big, beautiful new building in Washington, D.C. By the time it was done, the building cost a stunning $260,000. And at the time, this made this building, the Freedmen's Bank building, the most expensive building in Washington, D.C. Okay. And so at the same period of time in 1867 and 1868, after the trustees moved the main office from New York to Washington, D.C., the trustees also appointed a new member. A famed banker and philanthropist, Henry Cook, joined the Board of Trustees in 1867, and he began to chip away at the bank's benevolent foundations. In 1869, he began to lobby members of Congress to amend the bank's charter, and in 1870, this happened. At this time, Henry Cook was the president of the First National Bank. It was the Washington, D.C. branch of J. Cook and Company. J. Cook and Company was the first investment bank in the nation. And Henry Cook and J. Cook had cultivated very strong professional, personal, and business ties with members of the Lincoln administration. Um, they were close personal friends with Lincoln before his assassination. They were close personal friends with Salmon P. Chase, who was the secretary, the Treasury of the Secretary, and would become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they were very tightly connected. Um, but the bank's operation began to be undermined by the inclusion of Henry Cook, and it began in 1867. And that is when the bank made its first illegal loan. The bank, again, was supposed to operate as a simple savings bank. It was not supposed to make loans. It was only supposed to accept deposits, mostly of former slaves. But on April 19th, 1867, the bank makes its first illegal loan to a man named D.L. Eaton, and he received a loan for $1,000. It is worth saying that about 10 days later, this same person would join the board as the bank's actuary, the person responsible for evaluating the risk profile of the bank's investments. And so it is only 2 years into the bank's operation that white bank administrators start to slowly chip away at the benevolent foundations of the bank by slowly stealing money in loans from the bank. And of course, this money was deposited by African Americans recently emancipated from slavery. Subsequently, in 1870, Congress approves of the trustees amending the bank's charter, allowing it to operate as a commercial bank, not only as a savings bank. And the trustees start to make more and more loans, millions of dollars of loans. On record, the biggest loan goes to none other than Henry Cook for at least $500,000. And so, again, even though the bank was founded to serve uh, African Americans recently emancipated from slavery, it actually attracted an unlikely group of depositors, and that was white Americans. Um, the bank appealed to whites who wanted to put their money in a financial institution that was supposedly secured by the federal government, and this was actually not the case. But still, at this time, the Freedmen's Bank was seen as being one of the most stable financial institutions in the nation. And so, for example, on March 14th, 1870, when Robert Smalls opened his account at the Buford branch of the Freedmen's Bank, there was another group that opened an account on that same day. And the other was opened by a group of white planters who owned a company called Stone and Company based out of St. Helena's Island. And so this group of white depositors were among the thousands who did not let the name of the bank or the bank's mission keep them from opening accounts and depositing money. And actually, by 1872, about 10% of the bank's depositors were white. And so what you see here is a record for the same group of white men who opened their account on the same day as Robert Smalls. And so, of course, the Freedmen's Bank fulfilled an important market need for white Americans, especially during this period of time in American history where banking was incredibly unstable. And so even though the Freedmen's Bank was established for African Americans, white Americans did take the opportunity to open bank accounts. So, for example, in the Charleston branch, about 300 of the 2,790 depositors were white. And at the Buford branch, there was no other bank in the city at this time. And there were whites who were also depositors of this branch. And so, again, the Freedmen's Bank fulfilled a market need, not just for African Americans in certain regions of the South and the Mid-Atlantic, especially in South Carolina. And so, as African Americans continue to put millions of dollars into their bank accounts, a series of economic events upended the American economy, beginning with the transfinancial crash of September of 1873. And the catalyst for that financial crash was the failure of Jay Cooke and Company. Jay Cooke and Company was for leverage. They had been investing in railroad bonds and their investments were not paying off. And Jay Cooke and Company and Henry Cooke in particular were unable to fulfill their debt obligations to their debtors. And what that meant for the Freedmen's Bank was that they could not repay the $500,000 loan that they took from the Freedmen's Bank. And so Jay Cooke and Company declared bankruptcy on September 10th of 1870, and it sparked a financial crash. For the Freedmen's Bank, there were runs on branches throughout the country. There were runs on the branches in Charleston and Beaufort. The bank's white administrators decided to put a pause on the bank's operations, not allowing African Americans to withdraw money that they had in their accounts. Sometimes they were being forced to wait days, subsequently 30 and 60 days to withdraw money that they had in their accounts. And so at this point, the bank was teetering on collapse. Millions of dollars were being lent to mostly the friends, the business partners, and the colleagues of the bank's white administrators in Washington, D.C. There was finally an examination by the comptroller in February of 1873 and again in February of 1874. And the comptroller's examiners found that the bank was underwater. It was insolvent. The bank's books were not properly being kept. Um, Men who had borrowed money from the bank in Washington, D.C. were not paying back their loans. And so the bank's trustees, led by two Black trustees who joined the bank in 1867 and 1871, respectively, encouraged the other trustees to encourage John Alvord to step down. And so in his stead, they encouraged the most visible Black man, the most photographed Black man in America to join the bank as the bank's next president. And so, gaining a unanimous vote of confidence in March of 1874, the trustees selected Frederick Douglass to be the next president of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company. And so they persuaded him to be the bank's president. He was actually, and his sons were actually depositors. He was constantly making public pronouncements about the bank's success, about how African Americans should open accounts and deposit money in the bank as a demonstration of their readiness for political inclusion. But when he joins the board, speaks to the bank's actuary, and looks at the bank's finances, he realizes very quickly that he's made a horrible choice. He writes this in his 1881 autobiography. He talks about, unfortunately, the wisdom acquired in one experience seems not to serve for another one. It is altogether without a feeling of humiliation that he talks about his affiliation with the Freedmen's Bank. And so the fact that Douglass, again, one of the most recognizable orators of the 19th century, someone who was born enslaved, ran for his freedom, learned how to read, learned how to write, and wrote so brilliantly and eloquently. The fact that he would say that he was so humiliated by his affiliation with the bank tells us about the choice that he made and the state of the bank when Douglass joined as president. And so he is in the position for a couple of weeks, and he quickly realizes that he could not bring stability to what at this point was a crumbling and insolvent financial institution. And so on June 29th, 1874, Congress mandated that trustees shut down the bank. After going back and forth for a few days, the trustees acquiesced, and so on July 2nd, 1874, the bank officially ceased all operations. At this time, by July 2nd, 1874, there were 61,144 depositors who had about $2.9 million left in their bank accounts. Congress mandated that 3 commissioners be appointed to liquidate the bank's assets, which at that point amounted to about $3 million, and pay what was left to depositors. The commissioners subsequently dispersed 5 rounds of payments from 1875 to 1883. In 1875, if depositors could prove their identities by presenting a bank book, which was an accounting of everything they had in their account, depositors received about 20% of the money in their account. In 1878 and 1880, the same thing happened. If depositors could prove their identity, they could get 10% of what they had in their account. In 1882, that number rose to about 15%. And the last disbursement was in 1883, where depositors could receive a mere 5% of the money that they had in their account. The total dispersed was 44% of the money that depositors had in their account, which was about $1.6 million, which meant that the majority of money that depositors held in their accounts was lost. And so, of the remaining depositors, many of whom poured their life savings into the bank, into their accounts, they had to go through a series of steps to recoup even a small percentage of their money. And they and their descendants would ultimately spend the next 60 years lobbying members of Congress, their local lawmakers, comptrollers, attorneys generals, even presidents of the US, helping them to recoup their money, but to no avail. And so, to this end, Congress held a series of congressional inquiries that looked into the bank's failure. The first was in the fall of 1874, and the second was in 1876. Over the next several decades, the remaining Black members of Congress attempted to hold the bank's administrators accountable. Mississippi Senator Blanche K. Bruce, he was the first African American senator to serve a full term, pushed to lead a third and final official Senate inquiry in 1879 and 1880. And so, though he questioned the remaining members of the bank's board of trustees, including Douglas, Bruce also corresponded with Robert Smalls, where they kind of strategized how to put the bank's failure more on public display. No one was made to account for the bank's failure, not Henry Cook, not any other of the white members of the board of trustees. And so, but between 1874 and the final inquiry that was made by the Committee on Banking and Currency in 1901, more information was revealed about the state of the bank when it failed, such that it came to public knowledge that even though about 90% of the depositors were Black borrowers only received about 5% of the loan volume, and that 5% disproportionately went to Black churches and institutions in and around Washington, D.C. More information came out that we know, for example, that when the bank closed, it had less than $50,000 in cash and less than $400 in bonds as of July of 1874. Compare that with the fact that depositors still had about $2.9 million collectively in their bank accounts. But importantly, the bank had approximately $3.5 million outstanding in loans across almost 1,800 loans and 1,100 individual borrowers. In addition, the loans that had reached their date of maturity, which was about 83% of the loans, 95% of the loan volume went unpaid. And so, for example, depositors in the Charleston branch continue to have about $255,000 in their bank accounts. At the Beaufort branch, depositors had $55,500 remaining in their accounts when the bank failed. Now, if we compare that with the fact that 95% of the loan volume went unpaid, that means that white borrowers strategically chose not to repay their debt obligations, not just to the Freedmen's Bank, but to the African Americans who continue to have their money left in accounts without access to it. And so, in conclusion, the Freedmen's Bank failure had visible implications on African American communities across the nation, in particular in the South. The bank's demise influenced and shaped African Americans' engagement with the financial services industry for generations. And as the rise in racial violence continued to wipe out prosperous Black communities across the South in particular, we have the Freedmen's Bank to think about, to cast a long shadow on the ways in which economic violence shaped Black communities, especially after the end of Reconstruction. And so in the 20th century, African Americans attempted to create their own formal and informal institutions to service their own communities. We have smaller Black banks and community banks, mutual aid societies really filling this gap to provide both formal and informal financial services to African Americans. And so the banks collapsed in 1874, and the decades of congressional inquiries into the bank's demise proved to Black Americans that the federal government would not be willing to hold the financial services industry accountable for gambling with their hard-earned savings. And so the relationship between the predatory and fraught relationship between African Americans and the financial services industry really began during this period of Reconstruction, which was a moment of great economic promise for African Americans and for the nation. And so I'll end with these words from Frederick Douglass, and I think his words really do put it best. To the freedmen was given the machinery of liberty, but there was denied to them the steam to put it in motion. They were called citizens, but left subjects. They were called free, but left almost slaves. So I will end there, and I look forward to all of your questions. And what you see here, by the way, is a bank book for the Beaufort branch from a man named Ned Simmons. And all of these records are available at the National Archives in College Park, as long as we have them with federal funding.
Thank you, Justine.
Yeah.
I'll start off with my question. In my brief studies of the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank, everything said that it was due to poor management. It didn't give me an indication that it was actually abject thievery by white people. Why would that be? Am I missing something?
I think mismanagement is just a nicer way to say corruption and plunder. Yeah. Yes, it was mismanaged because of corruption and plunder.
Well, but the corruption seemed to be mostly in the hands of the people that ended up with the money.
Yeah, of course.
I'm trying to draw a conclusion here, but it appears apparent.
Yes.
Mr. Rigby, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Hill Edwards, you always provide a really great lecture, and I appreciate it. I was hearing your comment about 1/3 of the money in the bank could be used for low risk investments.
Yes.
What were the other 66% of assets allowed to be used for? I know because of the OCC Congress problem that they were not supposed to invest in land particularly.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't actually in the Freedmen's Bank contracts, was it? So
Sure.
they could have.
Yeah.
So what was the other money used for? And my other question is, did the bank failure sway public opinion, particularly in the Black communities,
Mm-hmm.
toward Frederick Douglass?
Mm-hmm.
Thank-
For Douglas?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great question. So yes, so a third, the bank's finance committee was supposed to invest a third in government bonds and securities, and so fairly low risk. The second third was supposed to be kept on hand in branches to help fulfill depositor demands. The third was supposed to be invested in operations, and so paying bank cashiers or bank managers, renting office space, buying bank buildings, and it was that last third where the trustees started to lend themselves money. So at the same time, they were buying branches instead of renting them out. Cashiers were trying to negotiate their salaries, and yeah, and so that's how the third of the bank's deposits were supposed to be spent. One, investment; two, on hand; and three, bank operations. And in terms of Douglas, yes, this is a less well-known aspect of Douglas's life, that he would really spend the rest of his life trying to redeem his kind of economic image. Yes, he continued to be very famous and very well respected, but he would write in his autobiography that he published in 1881 quite a bit about his experience with the bank. And so the Black press in particular were really hard on him, and perhaps rightfully so. Part of the bank's story is that many of the bank's presidents, the majority of the bank's presidents, were actually not bankers. They were philanthropists, they were politicians and kind of politically active, but they were not bankers. And so the fact that Douglas chose to take this position, I think, reflected a broader political ambition that he had. There were African American communities in the South that wanted him to move there to run for a Senate seat. He didn't want to do that, but he did have higher political aspirations, and he chose to join the bank as its president because I think he hoped that kind of ushering the bank out of its dark period would help him kind of establish his political foundations on kind of firmer ground, but that didn't end up happening. Thank you.
Question in the chat.
Thomas,
I was just saying, we have a question in the chat.
speak up.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah, there's a question.
Oh yeah, I can read that out. So this is from Margaret Johnson. Margaret says, great info and context. Thank you. Did the Freedmen's Bank failure also include the Military Savings Bank?
Great question. So the military savings banks were absorbed into the Freedmen's Bank branches, which is why in that first year there were bank branches in New Orleans, Norfolk, and Beaufort. And so ultimately when the bank failed, those branches failed as well.
But Dr. Hill Edwards, I have another question. Some of the reviews I read pose the collapse of the bank and the deliberative deconstruction of the reconstruction efforts as a real critical impediment that lasts today in the inequities in the relationships of Black and white wealth. Can you make some observations about that?
Sure. So there have been all of these really amazing studies by the Census Bureau, by the Fed, by the Treasury about kind of the racial wealth gap and economic inequality. And those studies will often talk about the roots of racial economic inequality in the mid 20th century. I say that we actually have to look a decade earlier. We have to look at the period of Reconstruction and really the history of the bank and African Americans' engagement with the Freedmen's Bank to get a broader understanding of why the economic relationship between African Americans and banks continues to be fraught. There is this idea that that it is kind of African Americans not understanding of financial literacy, or the fact that African Americans disproportionately choose to be unbanked and underbanked. But there are kind of reasons for both sides of this. There are historical reasons why African Americans are less likely to have sustained relationships with traditional white-owned financial institutions. There is kind of a trust gap as well. I mean, I've been saying this as I've been talking about the bank. I've had many conversations with members of my own family about keeping cash on hand as opposed to trusting financial institutions to invest my money in our money. There's a reason why my grandmother had money underneath her mattress as opposed to sometimes putting it in a financial institution. And I think that type of behavior comes from somewhere. And so I think to get kind of a broader understanding of why these conversations continue to be in our political discourse, especially about the racial wealth gap, we need to look at this period to gain a firmer understanding of where these conversations come from, because I think it has a longer history that is often not acknowledged.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really great. And I actually want to read both your books now. For class tomorrow night, we read an interview with historian Eric Foner.
Foner.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how to say his name. And this quote really stood out to me from him. He said that the first American Revolution and the second were fairly legalistic, but and this is his words, the uncompensated abolition of slavery was a pretty radical thing. But what I'm hearing is that whites found ways to appropriate efforts to help Black communities to compensate themselves. I mean, that is what stands out to me about this whole, whether it was directly intentional for that or ended up being that way. And I wondered, are there other instances where former white wealthy antebellum families found other ways to appropriate efforts to help African American communities to recoup parts of their lost wealth?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, I'll take the first part of that question first. I think part of what is an important aspect of the story of the bank is we are not talking about former Confederates. We are not talking about white Democrats in the South. The white bank administrators and trustees were supporters of Lincoln, were supporters of the war effort, were investing money, time, capital, political capital into the U.S. beating the Confederacy. And so that's an important part of this story as well. We are talking about white Republicans here. And so in many ways, the tragedy of the history of the bank, perhaps even the tragedy more broadly of Reconstruction, is that African Americans were experiencing racial violence from white Democrats and economic violence from white Republicans. And I think that is an important kind of lens through which to look at this. And so other instances of kind of white Southerners trying to kind of perhaps get compensation, the fact that sharecropping was a system that was tangential perhaps to slavery in a way that it tethered African Americans to labor and to land. I might say is a form of extended compensation after slavery's legal end in 1865. And so much of this is economic as well in terms of thinking about the kind of longer shadow of slavery and the ways in which slavery-like type of institutions continue to shape Black Americans' experiences, especially in the South into the 20th century.
Eva Keith?
Yes, thank you so much. I enjoyed the presentation. Early on, you mentioned that enslaved women were they went to the market to sell their wares. How were they able to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one of the ideas that I talk about in my first book is that they did this because this was seen as kind of being part and parcel of how slavery evolved, especially in South Carolina. Enslaved women often found ways to negotiate with their enslavers to kind of pay their enslavers perhaps a share of their profits. And increasingly, enslavers understood that by kind of allowing enslaved women in particular to work as market women, to work as vendors in public marketplaces, that this would be a way to keep them from running away and rebelling. And so these types of activities were, from the enslaver's perspective, seen as being a form of plantation enslaved management. It kept their enslaved property from running away. And so it was seen as kind of a tactic of negotiation.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question.
Sure.
The bank that collapsed. I know that there are, I don't know how many Black banks exist now in the US, but after the collapse of that bank, uh, is there information where a bank was started like shortly after that, or was it
Mhm.
in a later century?
Sure. So there were Black banks established about 10 years after the Freedmen's Bank failed in cities such as DC and Richmond. And so yeah, there were these types of smaller Black-owned financial institutions that emerged in the 1880s and 1890s to help African Americans economically in a way that the Freedmen's Bank could not. Um, and so it was slow going, but especially at the end of the end of the 19th, the early 20th centuries, African Americans kind of start to look inside their own communities to build up their own communities economically by establishing kind of smaller Black banks.
Jeff, you had your hand up?
The FDIC became an institution the government utilizes to safeguard banking, obviously after the collapse of the Great Depression. But the discussions about it appear to have started soon after, in a time frame, soon after the collapse of the bank you're talking about here. Is there was the FDIC finally instituted? Because you often hear the only time rich people get in trouble is when they steal from other rich people. Was it the sheer number of people who lost money in the Great Depression, or was it because it affected whites more than blacks? Or is there any information to say, to lean one way or the other?
Sure. I'm sure it was probably both. I mean, especially up until the 1930s, even with the establishment of the Fed in 1913, kind of economic expansion and contraction was kind of the norm. And so the idea that to kind of have kind of a stable Federal Reserve system, and then to establish the FDIC to kind of bring even more stability to the financial system was seen as being kind of a way to protect the wealth and capital of the wealthy, but also to kind of bring stability to the American economy writ large. And so I think it was kind of both. Yeah.
Ma'am?
What stories are you still holding in your research notebooks that haven't found their way into your book, if you have any?
That's a great question. Oh, yeah, I mean, when you write a book, you have to be kind of strategic about the types of stories that you tell. I mean, if I were to write this book again, no, I'm not sure I would change anything. But what I'm doing is I'm encouraging my graduate students, for example, to use these records because there's a lot to be said about children opening bank accounts. I talk about this, I want to say at the beginning of chapter 6 or 7 of my book, where I talk about a Black family in 1870 who a Black mother and father bring their 2 children to the Richmond branch, and they both open accounts in their kids' names, which I think is just so fascinating. And so there are instances of children having accounts, which I think is kind of a great way to think about financial literacy being taught through the generations. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, one story that I would love to talk more about is a subject that I've been thinking more and more about is the history of a man named John Mercer Langston, and I'm from Virginia, and so he kind of looms largely. Well, I live in Virginia, and so he looms largely for me. He was the first Black congressman from Virginia. He was was born not too far away from where I live. There's a golf course in DC named after him. And so I would love to kind of do a longer history of him because I think he's such a fascinating figure. But yeah, I mean, part of the challenge of this is kind of going through those depositor records and finding so many wonderful nuggets of information. And so if anything, I probably want to talk more about the experiences of Black children as they open their bank accounts for their first time along with their parents.
One more.
Thomas?
She's got one more.
Did you run into any pushback or openings in the publication and promotion of this material? Like what openings took place for you and what pushback did you face?
Mm. I think I've been really fortunate. The story of the Freedmen's Bank, I think, is just so spectacular and tragic that the process of getting this published was kind of better than I had expected it to be. I found a great editor who was immediately excited about this. My institution, the University of Virginia, has given me time off to write it. I've had a great team of research assistants to help me kind of dig through the historicals and archival sources. Yeah, I mean, I think that's been great. Um, there was a very interesting review in the Wall Street Journal that I think I've tried not to focus on too much, but that's kind of been one of the biggest blows or hurdles. But no, everyone's not going to love your work in your book, and that's fine. But I've been it's been really great to have kind of this experience that I've had with this book because it's just been kind of such a great way to introduce the history of the Freedmen's Bank to new readers. And so I've been really kind of heartened and surprised by how well the process has gone to go from idea to publication.
No, Thomas.
So this is a question from the chat. It's from Bernadette Hampton. They ask, was the Carver State Bank in Savannah, Georgia started as a result of this experience?
Oh, I am not sure. I would actually have to look up the Carver State Bank. I'm not sure if it was when it was established. Yeah, that's one of the ones I'm not sure about.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned that a percentage of the people who are depositing were white depositors. Do we know, is there a discrepancy in like the amount of funds that were able to be salvaged by white depositors versus black depositors? With the bank?
Yeah, disproportionately white depositors got a lot of their money back. I think because they perhaps read the tea leaves sooner in terms of what was happening within the American economy, especially after the Panic of 1873 or as it was going. And so white depositors were disproportionately able to get money in their bank accounts before African Americans could.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And weren't the trustees, at least in the beginning, all white? The people that were running the bank?
Yes. At first, all of the trustees were white. The
Yeah.
trustees attempted to add Henry Highland Garnett, who was a well-regarded Black intellectual. He did not want to join, and so the first group of Black trustees actually joined in 1867. But they really didn't have a lot of power. They were three Black ministers. It was not until Charles Purvis joined and John Mercer Langston joined, which was in the 1870s when they start to kind of exert more influence. But the vast majority of the bank's trustees, administrators, and cashiers were white.
Two-part question. For the white depositors, is there, through your research, was there any inkling of, was it mostly wealthy whites wanting to participate in the bank to help it, get some legitimacy or was it more, were you able to figure out, was it more poor whites who use this bank because they also could not access other banking systems? And then on the back end, as far as the rate of returns, were the rate of returns the same that traditional banks were paying, or were they less interest that could be earned? Was it on par with a traditional bank at the time, or was it less because it was an African American community?
Sure. So I'll take the second question first. So as stated in the bank's charter, the rate of return was supposed to be between 6 and 7%, which at this time was really high. Most savings banks in the mid 19th century were offering like 2%. And so, yes, it was relatively high. Interestingly enough, the trustees never approved an interest payment as high as 7%. It really did linger around like 3 or 4% if they could for interest payments at all. And so the bank was stated to be on the higher end, and actually members of Congress had begun to criticize the bank's trustees for promising such a high rate of return. And so in terms of white depositors, it depended on the branch. Disproportionately, the white depositors at the Washington, D.C. branch were fairly wealthy, and they held accounts because they essentially wanted to curry favor with the bank's finance committee to get loans. Around the country in places like Beaufort, the Freedmen's Bank branch there was really the only financial institution. And so it was both wealthy and poor whites. And so it depended on the branch and whether the specific city had a kind of wider array of savings banks. In DC, there were more bank branches, banks in general, but in a place like Beaufort, there were really none. And so the Freedmen's Bank branch there really captured a lot of the white customers that would have probably tried to go to their financial institutions. There is one question by John Baines that I think is important. Was the collapse of the bank an isolated incident, or was this one of the many banks? So the Freedmen's Bank was about one of 100 banks that failed as a result of the Panic of 1873. But it was the largest bank by depositors that failed. And I would contend that because the bank was specifically created for and marketed towards African Americans, that its failure had a kind of a wider, more outsized influence on the communities that the bank was created to serve.
More questions? The bank that was in Beaufort is still on Bay Street and is a store now. We have a picture. I don't know if you can put that up, Justine. But
Oh, here, let me see.
Bernadette Hampton, who's one of our new board members, and she was the president of the South Carolina Education Association about 7 years ago. She matriculated to the school then, and she's moved back to Beaufort, and she's now helping facilitate the in-person participation at Penn Center, which we're really excited about. Thank you, Bernadette. That building is still there.
Here, let me see. I'm finding it now.
While she's finding that, I'm gonna tell you that tomorrow night we have Vernon Burton, who's one of the nation's experts on Reconstruction. Vernon knocked on the door next door in Modjeska's house, is working on his dissertation on Reconstruction when he was a student at Princeton in 1971. And he ended up staying there, he said, for a couple of weeks. And she was that accommodating and had that much to say. And so Vernon is also like an emeritus scholar at Clemson and the University of Illinois, and incredibly prolific writer, and writes about Lincoln's unfinished work, looking at the attempts that the smashing of the crashing of this bank is only a part of the deconstruction of Reconstruction. And that we'll get into that more specifically. There we are at on Bay Street.
Oh, do you see it?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, good.
And that building, we have a picture we can post later of the original building that I think is the same. That you can tell perhaps because of the windows almost, but that's Bay Street is the main drag in Beaufort, and the original one, or at least the one that lasted for a while, was on Bay Street. And that Robert Small's house was a block behind that. And those houses, in my growing up in Beaufort, Robert Small's was the segregated high school for the separate but unequal school for the Black people. And that Robert Small's house also had carvings and the mantelpiece and stuff from the Union soldiers that stayed there, as many of the houses on Bay Street did. So we'll get into Reconstruction tomorrow at 6:30 here. And that I want to give you a heads up because I want Dr. Hill Edwards to perhaps tune into the deeper dive next Sunday at 4 o'clock. Fergus Bordewich, an unforgettable name and an unforgettable writer, has a book out called Clan War. And talking about the deconstruction of Reconstruction, the insurrection clause that we all know that Trump was charged with and got away with, was used once before. And it was used in 1870-71, and President Grant declared martial law, suspended habeas corpus, and arrested over 600 white terrorists who were Ku Klux Klan members in 9 upstate counties in South Carolina. And so that the violence was so bad, and we're talking about the federal troops not leaving until 77, I believe it was. Is that right, Justine?
Yes.
Yeah, 77. And so even immediately after the war, these Confederates, they didn't give up. And they're still fighting, you may have noticed. But that we get into some really interesting stuff about all these arrests here in South Carolina, where the trials, we've got trial transcripts from the federal court in Columbia where they were tried, and contemporaneous news clips that I think lends some human understanding to the situation we find ourselves in today in reading the reportage from the local newspapers that sounds like something you would read today about critical race theory. And that kind of white supremacy woven so deeply into the fabric of this state and nation. But let's give Justine a big hand. We may get her back someday.
Thank you so much for having me again.
We'll get you a bus ticket next time so you can come see us in person.
Sounds good.
All right, well, thank you so much. We'll see
Thank you
y'all,
for having me.
and we'll see most of you tomorrow night. And you're welcome to come, Justine, to see Vernon Burton. Stay in touch, ma'am.
Have a good night.